exercises on the people in general, hence reducing it to a non-mechanical process. George Bernard Shaw also tried to highlight a second limitation of the current legal order, which was about complete negligence and ignorance of the spot of the crime. For example, the lady and the man portrayed in the drama, like when the scene of the crime, when it was all just being depicted, at that time, the stage, or you can say the pre-stage, which was some minutes before those 4 minutes when the crime was committed, no one took into account the mentality and the emotions he was wrestling with at the time the crime was committed. It was just considered to be a simple case of forgery, and the lawyer in the defense, though he did try to set up a completely overwhelming structure that would sort out the different implications of his actions, still the judges refused to accept them. And even when the defense lawyer tried to highlight that the judicial system in England is no more than a bunch of laws which are thrusted upon mankind, the judges didn't relent. They didn't relent because they have been framed, they have been programmed to completely and mechanically follow the process of law. There is no denial, no acceptance, no refusal, even. And this is the biggest problem of our society, of the legal order. Since I said that judges have been reduced to the mere status of robots who are just using the artificial brains, artificially carrying out the programs mentioned in the constitution without talking or thinking about the emotional aspects. Now you may ask me that why should an act be guarded with emotions? When we are judging an act, why should we judge it on the basis of the emotions which rendered the action? Because really, no one does that. We have always been told that a man may labor as hard as he can, but if the fruit of his actions is not available, then no one believes in his labor. No one likes to think that he has labored, and no one even believes it. The same is happening with the judicial system. A person may do an action in a different spirit, he may commit it in a different spirit altogether, but it's legally synthesized, legally interpreted in the same way whatsoever, because it's only the result that matters, it's only the evidence. And here comes in the question that why should there be a space for emotions and emotional interpretation in the legal system? See, for this, we need to understand that when we are judging something or when we are judging someone, we are actually judging the actions which he did. We are not judging his figure, we are not judging how tall or short he is. We are judging what he has done. When we are judging what he has done, we should also judge his intentions. Because an act is not just made by hands or done by hands and legs, it is done using mind as well. If an act is planned, a lot of logical thinking process is involved in it. So why shouldn't we take it into account? If we're talking about an act, if we're judging a deed, a coup, we should also judge the intentions behind it, which are actually the reasons for the act. We should judge the mental state of the person at the time he was committing the act. Maybe we can say that we have no evidence to prove the mental state of a person at the time the act was being committed. But then again, just think, if we don't have mental evidence, if we don't have the evidence for something, does it mean that we should take in some different kind of evidence and just make the judgment? If you don't agree at this point, I would like to explain it to you further. It has been easily defined by every constitution that 100 culprits can be rendered free, but a single culprit shouldn't, a poor culprit who hasn't really committed and is just an accused, he shouldn't be tortured needlessly. even if 1,000 other culprits who actually committed the crime are set free because of him, to save one single accused person. In this regard, you can say that we hold the power of a noble accused above the power of the Constitution. So, in what we are talking about, why can't we hold the power of no evidence above the power of evidence but incomplete? Means, shouldn't we give more weightage to emotional, psychological, and mental behavior of a person at the time he was committing the crime? And just because we have no evidence to state this, we can't give a wrong judgment. If you try to think it critically and infuse it with logical reasoning, then you will understand that, as George Bernard Shaw himself highlighted, the judgment process today is actually mathematical. It's not even logical, because a logical judgment process would take into account all the factors that constitute it. But the judgment process these days is absolutely mathematical. It takes into account only the result and the derivations. It doesn't try to logically think of the actions, of the intentions, the inclinations that could be the reason for the crime, and destroys the lives of people without even caring for the intentions behind the actions. This is a highly chaotic judgment process and highly imperfect as well. But we have artificially tried to explain to ourselves that it's a perfect legal system, while it's not. It's not even logical. Plain mathematics is involved in judging, because acts are the only things that are considered at the time of judgment. No one really cares about the intentions or the state of a person. The third point that can be argued of against this legal system is that judges can be easily substituted by robots in this system. The peculiar difference between the American Constitution and constitutions of other countries, as I have highlighted, is that judges have no power in other constituencies, in other constitutions. While the judge in America has every right to assess the situation, while judges in other countries are completely based on the evidence which is provided by the prosecutor and what the witnesses say in court. They don't, when as soon as they sit on this seat, they completely become devoid of all emotions and become so stern. Of course, legal system could be considered logical in this sense if it's plainly devoid of all emotions. But just come to think of it for a second, that if an act is made in an emotional sense, shouldn't its judgment also count the emotions involved? If it's counting the result, it should also count the cause. Why should only the result be counted? Just as we often argue to our parents that, of course, I didn't score well, but that doesn't mean I didn't labor. We do argue about this with our parents, and sometimes when our parents refuse to accept this argument, we think they are conservative. Same can be argued for the current legal system. We can say it's very conservative. It's not at all modern and civilized, because it's just counting the actions and what act is in front of it. Just as our parents only care about our marks, they never care about the labor or the hours that we put into scoring whatever we did on the basis of our intelligence question. In the same way, the legal system and the judges today only care about what you finally did on the spot of the crime. They don't think, they don't care about the conditions that forced you into doing what you did. So these three are actually the highest level of imperfections in our legal system, and as I said, they can't be avoided. Maybe we can avoid the imperfections in Newton's laws of motion because they're not harming us directly. We can't see ourselves falling down the well just because the Newton's laws of motion is imperfect. We don't care. It can be imperfect. It's okay. It's just mathematics. To some extent, we can ignore its imperfections, though at large scale we can't. But at a normal scale, at a macroscopic scale, we can ignore its imperfections. But listen, we can't ignore the imperfections of our legal system, because the imperfections of the legal system are causing people to go to jail, to be imprisoned uselessly, mercilessly. So this is a fine line between accepting and refusal of imperfections. We need to refuse this imperfection, and this is where the role of a lawyer comes in. I would say that any student of law will start appreciating the role of a lawyer once he reads Justice by George Bernard Shaw. The role of a lawyer as the backbone of the society, as the basic and the sovereign interpreter of the laws created by the legislator, can undoubtedly be considered of an ethereal rank. When Freud, in the novel, tries to argue against several imperfections that are created in the society, we actually mean to state that in his speech which he gave to the judge, he tried to highlight the fact that the judge should think of the act on a more international basis by considering more factors in view, by thinking on a broad scale rather than just minutely assessing the action. Hence you see that in the court of Shaw, it's the lawyer who plays the basic role in interpreting the law. The judge is just a robot in the court of Shaw. It's the lawyer who does the real interpretation, who brings the real view of the world in front of the judge, who really truly assesses and interprets the crime. And in this way, he is actually the ultimate interpreter of the law and the legal order and the society as a whole. This is what made me say that a lawyer is the backbone of the society. He is a backbone of the society in terms of his interpretations. Maybe we thank the legislator for giving us the laws, but as I highlighted, those laws are never perfect if the interpretations that pertain to them are imperfect. And the true interpreter in the court of Shaw is actually the lawyer. And this makes lawyer the fundamental substratum of every civilian society. So, to throw more light on the character of a lawyer, I would thus like to recount the entire episode of George Bernard Shaw's epic drama, and I would want you to listen to it properly, because at the end of the drama there will be some arguments, and unless you have been a good listener, you will not be able to criticize those arguments. So, there was a young man 2 years older than his fiancée, and he used to work in a law firm. In the law firm, he was a regular worker, an extremely ethical being, liked by all his colleagues, and generally a man with a good personality, a good satire, a good and appreciable sense of humor, and thus a penchant in general. What this drama will try to highlight is that a man of so noble a nature can be imperfect, but he will be imperfect due to the imperfections of his mental state at the time of committing the crime. When he is thus committing the crime, he is doing an action, and the result of that action can be judged as the result of an action of a forgery, and this sentences him to life imprisonment. And this actually, the end of the novel is about him ending up his life. So you see that how a simple act of injustice on behalf of the legal order actually ruined the life of this man, and this was the first argument given by his lawyer. So listen on. So is this person is a friendly man, a charming personality, and so on. By work of destiny, he happens to fall in love with someone in the country who had been mentally and emotionally psychologically depressed by her previous fiancé. Once it so happened that as the man was seated on his chair and was doing his office work, she came in, ran a pet cough, and then, as she wanted to talk to him, she first happened to meet his senior and was finally allowed to talk to him. After the talks and all, it thus happened he seemed to be naturally worried about the talks, and though no one interrogated him thus, since he all kept it with himself, there were no further interrogations about it. What happens is that a few weeks later, the boss happens to find that a very severe and simple act of forgery has been committed in his empire. The problem with the forgery case was that there was a TY added to 9 on the check and a 0 added to 9 in the counterfeit of the check. And the check had been issued by the young man. And there was a colleague of the young man of the same age as his, and both were equally suspected. The thing was, the colleague had actually moved to Australia a few days ago. The case of forgery, and that's where all suspicion lay on him. Now you can say that this was a very planned case of forgery. The reason was that he tried to plan it in such a way so that all the consequences actually and the blame all fall on his poor colleague. However, once everyone got to know that the case was a case of forgery and it was committed by this man, the boss, the son of the boss, decides to take him to court. Of course, several of their colleagues stopped him from that. They thought that it would ruin the empire, and since he was just a noble person and it was his first act committed as such, he deserved to be pardoned since it was the first legal action taken by him, and that he did for the want of money to give to his fiancée. So, what happened was that when he was taken to court, he had to hire a lawyer for him, and before the time of the bail and presentation in the court, there was a stage when he had to dwell in prison for 2 months. When when his case was presented in the court, the atmosphere there was completely off from what it had been before. The fiancé was presented. There were some witnesses who were called for, and also a colleague of the young man. When all the witnesses were thus presented in the British court, the judge, as he was seated, was allowed to decide about the course of action he would take. Now, the thing was, the crime had already been accepted by the young man. He had accepted that it was he who had committed it, hence, there was nothing like trying to prove against the act of commission. The only thing that was left to be proved was that it was done due to mental disarrangement of the mind. And now, as the case is presented in the court, and the defense lawyer is trying to present his views. So, the defense lawyer argues with the judge that since they have presented proper evidence that before the commission of crime, the young man, was not in a normal state of mind. And they also stated that some minutes before he ran to the bank, which was a course of 4 minutes, it was actually such that as he was going to the bank, he happened to talk to one of his colleagues. And the colleague